Allison Coffelt, thank you for being here and really appreciate your time. And wanted to talk with you about your book, Maps Are Lines We Draw, A Trip Through Haiti, and what prompted that. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Could you give us a kind of a background of what made you do this journey in the way that you did it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I first became interested in Haiti actually in high school. I had a teacher Matt Cohn, who's someone I still keep in touch with, who introduced us to the work of Partners in Health and Paul Farmer, vis-a-vis Mountains Beyond Mountains, which many of the folks watching this have probably heard of. It's a wonderful book by Tracy Kidder. Came out
Sure.
quite some time ago. But that was really my first introduction to Haiti and in a larger part, my first introduction to thinking about health equity. It was a time in my life where I was really interested in kind of looking beyond myself, which I talk about a little bit in the book. And it just was kind of like the right place, the right time. I kind of latched on to um, thinking about how resources are distributed. Ultimately, one of the questions that comes up in the book is how we draw lines between ourselves and others, how we think about the other. And so that's the seeds of a lot of this book were planted during high school. But then after that, I continued to be really interested, really engaged in global health equity, and social justice work. And ultimately, I started writing the book probably 8 to 10 years after I became interested in it, and it was about a 5 year project to write the book. The book came out in 2018. So the book is, yeah, that's a little bit about the background.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting book because it weaves together these different genres. There are elements of memoir, travel writing, global health critique, narrative journalism, philosophical reflections. And so these genres not only, I think, shape how the story is told, but also influence how we as readers engage with its deeper questions. So I was wondering which one of these genres, or maybe there's something else that feels most compelling or essential to you in conveying the story that you wanted to tell,
Well,
and
no,
how this helped you evolve the process of writing.
yeah, I love that you brought up I would, maybe say interdisciplinarity of the book, because that felt like really kind of the only way to stay true to what I wanted to do. And it ended up being humorously a little bit of a marketing problem later, because this book doesn't quite fit neatly into one category. It's not quite full memoir, though there are certainly memoir components in it. It's not fully an essay. I mean, though it's essayistic, and I would say that's the form it's closest to if we had to pick a writing form. Um,
Hmm.
it's got a lot of journalism. I did do some firsthand reporting. I mean, the book is based on my time with the physician, Dr. Gardy, in Haiti over the course of handful of days. That's sort of like the main story. But then I do a ton of research, and I think that was really important for me in thinking about how we tell the stories we tell about someplace else. I really wanted to look at how has Haiti been written about before? How have we written about how have we written about foreign countries? How have we written about poor countries? I wanted to really look at those things and be aware of them and be conscious of them as I was constructing this new narrative, because, kind of no matter what, this story that I was going to write down was going to be sitting in that tradition of a white woman going to Haiti and writing about it. So there's not a lot of ways I can get around that, right? So if I'm going to write the book, which for a long time I didn't mention this earlier in the question, but for a very long time I wanted to go to Haiti, and I wanted to have experiences meeting people and exploring my interest in global health there. But I also felt like, couldn't I just donate that money? So knowing that, even just getting there felt like I had to kind of I had to face some different ethical questions from inward to finally go, and then to write the book. There was a whole nother series of ethical questions that came up. Um, so research was a huge component. Research was a big part of what I wanted to include in the book, and what I wanted to bring to the reader. I want that reader to go on a journey with me, not just in this road trip, which is the central narrative of the book, but I want the reader to go on a research journey with me.
Did you do the research before you went, or um, did your experiences then lead you to other research? What,
Yeah.
how did that work? Yeah.
Oh, well, I love you. You have a soft spot for research, so I could talk about this all day, but it was a little bit of both. I definitely read a lot before I went. Like I said, I had been interested in the topic for, quite some time, almost a decade before I finally got on a plane. So I'd done a lot of reading. I'd spoken with a lot of people. I had worked in and for different health equity organizations, and global health organizations. So I had some firsthand kind of just conversations and things to pull from research. And then after returning from my trip, I also then really was able to, I think, refine my questions a little bit more and narrow my research. That being said, though, I did still do a lot of research when I came back. I
Mm.
wrote the book while I was a master's student. I wrote the bulk of the book while I was a master's student in creative writing at the University of Missouri. And so I really used the master's thesis project as a way to guide and direct my research. So I had a lot of really incredible advisors, wonderful people to work with there that helped me look at anthropology, ethnography, folklore, obviously a lot of nonfiction writing and the long tradition of nonfiction and lyric nonfiction. So I use that kind of academic experience too to kind of have the time and space to do the research that I felt like I needed to do to make a good, I guess, a good stab at this.
Yeah, I'm wondering what in your background, in your personal background, perhaps growing up or, where you come from that really got you interested in global health equity and those issues. Because, in many ways, I just see you as a kind of a traveler, and I just wonder where this comes from.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think, I'm a pretty curious person. My family really also likes to travel. We did some traveling growing up, but I would say, I have this moment in the book that I paint this scene as being I was a little kid. I don't know how old, probably
Mhm.
remember being 5 or 8 or 10 ish. And we had a globe in our house. And I know you know this because you've read the book, but for those who haven't, there's a scene where I'm just spinning the globe. And it sat in our house in sort of this corner, and it was like a favorite game as a kid to just, because it's so tactile, right? You can spin it, and it was bumpy too, like it had little ridges and stuff. And I just remember thinking, I don't know what I remember thinking exactly, but I remember that experience, just realizing how much more out there was. It was like, here we are, and here's everything else.
Right,
Um,
yeah.
and I think that, it sounds like a bit of a whim, but I think, in the book, I examine like, what does it really mean to have had a globe in your house growing up? I mean, what does it mean to have that privilege? What does it mean to have um, that sense of like you can kind of spin the world on its axis and look at it, or sort of play with it, I guess. So I think and then like I mentioned earlier, on top of that, I'm a pretty curious person. I think in my background, I before kind of going in a different direction professionally, I think I would have been a really I looked at doing journalism. So I think there's a strong sense of wanting to go out and kind of listen to the stories of other people and report on them, um, and just hear from other perspectives. That's kind of always been part of my DNA, I guess.
When you're spinning the globe, were there particular countries that you landed on that at random that really intrigued you, and why Haiti? How did
Yeah,
you get
yeah.
there?
Well, in terms of why Haiti, I really think it goes back to the experience I had in high school, but also then realizing that that's those experience I had reading this other book. And I think reading Mountains Beyond Mountains
Hmm.
helped me really understand viscerally the power that literature can have. I understood that from a young age. I was very fortunate to have been raised in a household that really valued reading, that really valued education. But once you have an experience with a book, and I think many people have had this experience with a novel or a nonfiction, like it doesn't necessarily matter what genre the book is. But I mean, if you have an experience with a book that really kind of challenges you and shapes you and asks you to see things or look or think a little bit differently, that can be formative. That can really, that to me, that really just elevates what it really imprinted on me what a book could do. No pun intended.
Yeah.
And I think, in terms of the question about the globe and the spinning, it's so funny because like as a little kid, you'd sort of be like, oh, I'm gonna, I write about this in the book a little bit. I would spin, and I would say like 9 times out of 10, I end up in the ocean, which I definitely think about now in retrospect when we think about the water crisis and what makes our planet different, and we think about climate change. But that's probably a story for a different conversation.
Yeah, tell us a bit about your travel experience with Dr. Gardy.
Yeah, so I went on a road trip with Dr. Gardy. He has a clinic outside of Port-au-Prince, a couple of hours outside of Port-au-Prince. And I met him through someone in my town who had worked with him. She is a nurse who's from Haiti, and she connected me with him. And his clinic has hosted and in the past, and I believe still continues to host folks who want to come and help support the work that they're doing. That being said, it is exclusively a Haitian run clinic. It is run by Haitian physicians and Haitian nurses and Dr. Gardy. So that's a little bit about like, that's sort of the main narrative of the book. Is it opens with me, it was close to opens with me, waiting to get in the car with him. And it kind of concludes with the end of our time. But one thing that was really important to me in the book was that even though that's sort of the arc of the plot, I really wanted to include a much broader history. And I really wanted to include, I have things from like the Civil War in the United States. I have things from, the Haitian Revolution in the early 1800s. I have things from like NAFTA and trade and things like that. So I really wanted to take a broader lens to kind of try to think about how what we're seeing playing outside the car window or playing, out in conversations that I'm having in person, what are the historical reasons that we're here now doing this?
Yeah. Uh, I was wondering about your how you develop the ability to notice details. Where did that come from?
That's
Are
such
you
a
do you have a graphic background, or do you consider yourself a visual person versus an auditory person, or how do you notice things?
it's a great question. I wish I could answer because I would love to um, teach them, be able to, I do teach creative writing, but I also have a young daughter, and I watch her watch everything, and nothing escapes her notice, and I've heard that this is common, right, among children. Like kids notice everything. Everybody kind of says this; it's an axiom. But I think, in terms of my own practice, I'm not sure. I think a lot of it goes back to, honestly, I think it goes back to reading. I think that
Yeah.
I am trained, and we see this a lot with narrative medicine. We spend so much time and energy and focus on the skill of close reading. That has been my bread and butter for how, sort of both my professional career, but also how I move through the world. It's just like paying attention. Now, we definitely talk about many things I've forgotten or things I don't remember, things like that. But I think that in general, as a practice, reading sharpens our ability to notice and to notice what we notice, right? So, and of course, there are a lot of spiritual practices as well. And I'm thinking of like meditation is all about noticing what you notice as well. But to me, that skill first, I think is first founded in my humanities training. So there's a vote for the humanities right there.
Yeah, and so much of what I was really interested too was your, I think your habit of paying attention on purpose. It's kind of a mindfulness act where you're looking out the window. I love that. I love those scenes because it just reminds me of road trips that I've taken in other countries where I'm being driven around, and I have a couple essays, one in Pakistan, one from Ethiopia, where it's totally taken from inside the window.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a safe place for me. I wasn't really interacting with people, and that gets into, I guess, an issue of how much of your trip involved really interacting with people, not just objectifying them and writing about them as subjects, but interacting with them. Can you talk about that a bit and what you learned from that?
Yeah, I can. And I would just say too that on your point about kind of looking out the window and when you're traveling, I mean, I think a lot of that does also go back to intention.
Yeah.
I went to Haiti with the intention of writing something. I spent time at two different global health centers while I was there, and I knew that I was going to be taking a lot of notes. I think there was somewhere in the back of my head that wanted to make it into a book, but I didn't. That felt like way too big of a project. I knew I would be writing some articles for these two different organizations. I promised them that. So there was a clear intention, and I think that also makes a big difference. And as an aside, well, it's not really an aside, but as a sort of a point, I guess, for our audience who are involved with narrative Mindworks, I think that that is also a key component of narrative medicine. In our practice of narrative medicine, we go into the writing workshop, we go into the reading experience with the intention of paying attention, right? And if we set that up front, it kind of primes the pump a little bit, in a way that I don't think, as much as I would love, I don't think that I always move through the world, paying that close of attention, or intending to play that close of attention. For example, when I'm just driving back and forth around my daily commutes.
Hmm.
Um, so that's one aspect. Can you repeat your other part of the question around the conversations, if you remember it, or
I don't remember, but I'm going to ask you another question since we're on the
yeah,
topic of how you pay attention. In maps, your reflections seem deeply grounded in the practices of attention, representation, and affiliation. The core elements of ethical storytelling and narrative engagement. So I was wondering how those concepts, um, if at all, shaped your approach to writing about Haiti. Particularly, I think, in navigating the balance between bearing witness to other stories and acknowledging your position as an outsider.
yeah, absolutely. Um, one of the reasons I was drawn to narrative medicine in the first place
Hmm.
was because of those three pillars: the attention, the representation, and the affiliation. I wrote this book largely without, really pretty much without knowledge of narrative medicine as a field.
Right.
I knew about it sort of, as in I had visited the Columbia website and I was very interested in it. And I knew a little bit that it existed, I think, kind of near to the end of writing this book. But I had not read anything, really by the scholars who work in this field. And I certainly, of course, hadn't started any kind of training in this field, which I ended up, going on to do. So but I think that the attention and the representation and the affiliation are all things I was thinking about. We've already discussed attention. I think representation was required in this book a lot of reflection and consideration around, what my role was as a writer, and what my role was in what I hope is the careful handling of other people's stories. In this way, I think representation and affiliation are really intertwined in this book, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, there's sort of a certain kind of stance. Like there's certain aspects of my identity that are not going to change in when just going into this situation. Like I'm from the U.S. I'm white. I'm, privileged. I have so much more economic, um, ability and privilege than most of the people I spoke with. Um, so I think those things, there's certain things that are just that are there. And I think that writing this book also forced me to just name them, and both sort of to myself, which I had already done, but also in the text. Like, let's be honest about those. Let's get some of those out of the way. And let's think about how those dynamics may or may not play out in the interaction that I'm reporting on. Right. So I think it's a little bit like a pushback against this idea that I could sort of just be a narrator that's faceless or bodiless or invisible. I felt like it was really important to be forthright about my position. And this is where I think affiliation comes in, right? And how I connected or didn't, or how I related to the people I spoke with. And I think that too, I tried to do that. So that was sort of like on the personal or the individual level. And then I tried to do it a little bit on the larger scale of the book project. So if we think about the book as I mentioned earlier, kind of fitting into some kind of genre, it's a little bit genre defined, but not totally. I spend a chapter of the book examining guidebooks and looking at the tradition of guidebooks. Now, of course, you go somewhere, you pull out your phone, you scroll through an article, or you look at, I don't know,
Hmm.
whatever, TripAdvisor, lonelyplanet.com, I don't know. But, for the majority of human history of travel, you relied on letters, you relied on guidebooks, and you relied on personal guides. And so I looked at those things as documents, as part of the project of this book, because I wanted to think about too, like, what is a guide? What service or purpose does a guide serve? How does the interaction between a guide, whether it's a physical book or a person, and the person who's benefiting from that guide, how does that relationship look? So it kind of, I tried to kind of do it on two levels, sort of just the basic kind of reporting and representation level, and then the project of the book.
Yeah. The, the subject of guidebook fascinates me. I have about 50 years worth of guidebooks.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. What a trip.
yeah, and I'd love to see um, how the reporting changes, because some countries you had no access to, and then some we have access to. The boundaries are constantly changing. So you mentioned the Kidder book, but I was wondering about other travel writers as well that really influenced your work. Who are your favorite travel writers?
Ooh,
If you have any, did you have travel writers before you did this, before you became one yourself? Not that I
um,
would call this strictly travel writing. I know it's interdisciplinary. It's a
yeah,
complicated book.
I relied a lot on literature for this book. I also relied a lot on historical documents. I looked at some of the, as you know, because you've read the book, but for those of the folks who are listening who haven't, I did look at physical guides. So the guidebook chapter, I looked at a guidebook from, I actually got it down just before this chat because I was trying to remember about where it was from, but it's, here it is. It's a reprint of a historical guide to Haiti, and
Mm.
it gets into, for example, the geography and the animal kingdom and all of these kinds of things. And this is from the 1860s, 1861. And then I looked at a guide from the 1950s, and then I looked at a contemporary guide from Lonely Planet. But I would say in terms of writers, I mean, I looked Jamaica Kincaid's book A Small Place was a huge influence for me. Um, I read a lot of work from Amy. I'm so embarrassed that I can't remember her last name right now, but she's been writing about Haiti for years now. I also pulled a lot from essays and the essay genre. I really trying to think. It's a little difficult to do this. My bookcase is in the other room. I read also a lot of global health books. So I read a lot of historical accounts of. I read a book called Damming the Flood, which was really influential in thinking about the political history in Haiti and the U.S. involvement in that. I've read a lot of Paul Farmer's work on Haiti, the uses of Haiti, partners with the poor. So yeah, anyway, I think I don't think I have a favorite travel writer. I think I tended to read literature that involved some sense of almost like a conflict between um, cultures, because
Hmm.
I thought in many ways that was what was happening, right? Like when we look at a when we say things or think about Haiti, it's almost like in general, I think in the US consciousness, it's this idea that it's oh, it's Haiti, it's over there. But really, like there's been, 200 plus years of conflict between our two countries that most people don't know very much about. We don't know that the United States occupied Haiti for a long time and still is very involved in their elections, for example. Um, so that's kind of where I gravitated.
Do
Do
you,
you
yeah.
favorite? Do you have any favorite travel writers or?
Well, Paul Theroux was one that I always, really loved and inspired me to take trips, through train travel. Really, I loved his books on the Great Railway Bazaar and other books about just arriving and noticing things and his commentaries on that. So that really influenced me to get out and see the world. And also Bruce Chatwin. I'm not sure if I had mentioned his book to you when we were writing back and forth, but Bruce Chatwin's book, The Songlines, and his book on the Aboriginal culture of Australia and their how they sing the world into existence. So that really influenced me as well. And so
Yeah, I have a colleague who really who's talked about that. Yeah, singing the world into existence, and
yeah,
yes, yeah, yeah.
I have to say the one thing that really influenced me to read your book was the title, "Maps Are Lines We Draw," and you and I talked about the Four Corners area of
Hmm.
the United States, that's located within the Navajo Nation. And it's like these two cultures, one culture, ours, that believes strongly in boundaries and maps. And now we're in this era of perhaps renaming the Gulf of Mexico. Um, and then, and Four Corners is really situated within this land that really has no boundaries in the same way. So that really drew me into into your book, just the title, and so it really made me wonder what kind of reception you've gotten from people. What drew them into your book? What have people told you about what prompted them to start reading your work?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate your thinking about the title because titles are I find titles very difficult. Often as a writer, you write something and then you're sort of at the end and it's like, oh no, I'm gonna need a title for this. It lives in your head as the essay about blah 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 blah. And then the rubber hits the road and you've got to name it. So it wasn't the original name of the book, but the challenge kind of became, how do I create a title that feels true to the central question of the book? And I would identify the central question of the book as how do we define our sense of here and there?
Hmm.
Um, where do we draw those lines? And what influences that line drawing? So there was lines, right? Like just in that, it's like lines, drawing, okay. And then thinking about map making as well. And then when I started and had help with this brainstorm, kind of getting some of these ideas down, I came on to the idea that maps are lines we draw, and I really latched onto it because it felt like it was drawing attention to the constructed nature of these borders. Um,
Exactly.
and I think that has pulled. I've heard from readers that has pulled people in. That has sort of made people go, oh, well, what's that book about? And so I'm actually quite pleased with the title in the end, though it was very, very difficult to get there. Um, and I think, to your point about the Four Corners, I had the joyful experience of living in the Southwest for about 5 years. And I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Missouri. I live right now in St. Louis, and I'm from Columbia, Missouri. I just have to put that in. Shout out to Columbia, Missouri. But living out west, it's a very different landscape, and it's there's a lot more influence from Native culture. In a way, there's a presence of Native land, Native culture, Native rights that I don't see as much in the Midwest. That's not to say it's not here. It's just more prevalent and more, I think, part of the everyday sort of physical and like cultural landscape out west. And I think the Four Corners as examples is potent. I feel like for some people it's significant, right? Because it's it's a cool spot on a map, right? Like it's like this four straight line, two straight lines, and they, bisect each other. But of course, in Navajo culture and other cultures, it's also, I believe, the creation point for the universe, right? Like that people came up from the ground from that spot. And I also think that kind of points to the fact that these places can mean a lot of things to different people.
Yeah, that's right. It really brings up the issue of what's sacred to people. And I think in our culture, maps are certainly sacred. And if you've ever been to the Four Corners area, it's kind of a raised platform, and it's almost like an altar, and it's
Mm.
completely arbitrary, but it's what we value. And I think there are other maps like that I've seen where several states come together, and it's completely arbitrary, and subject to being withdrawn. So our spirituality is in some ways kind of arbitrary in the sense of where we like to draw the lines. And you also mentioned I think the filters by which you bring to this work. You're really aware of that. You're really aware, I think, of the personal filters that you bring. You're a white woman. You've privilege from the United States. Other things. Have the filters shifted around or changed? Has uh, working with representing people in the most authentic way that you can change your notion of yourself and who you are?
Yeah, I think it has. I think there's a couple of places my mind goes with that question. The first one is the idea that there's a lot of writing on this, but I don't know that our identities are always are quite as fixed as we would believe. You
Yeah.
know, Even just mentioning in that last comment about moving, from one part of the same country to back to the part of the country that I'm from, I feel different coming back. I feel that I don't have the same filters anymore. My interpretation of this place, this immediate place where I'm living, is very different, having spent um, 5 years somewhere else in a very different culture, even within the same country, as I mentioned. So I think that's just one example. Becoming a parent has shifted my identity quite a bit. Becoming just there's just all these things, right, that we that life happens, things happen, and our filters change. I think being aware of them feels like to me, one of the essential sort of tasks if we're going to be engaged in ethical storytelling and meaningful storytelling, and not just storytelling too, right, but just communicating with others and representing others. And so, yeah, that's one of the things about filters. I think writing the book also caused / gave me the opportunity to examine these questions over a long period of time. Books are slow media, very slow media. It takes a long time to write them, and years pass, and time goes by and other things happen in one's life. Um, and even in the course of writing, your experiences can inform and shift those filters, and you might revisit conversations or material that you had and treat it in a different way than you or slightly different way than you would have that first time around, that first pass, that first observation.
Do you do the same thing with with this book with maps? The idea of you're a different person than when you wrote it.
Yeah.
Are there parts that you think I really would love to add an addendum or change this chapter, re-edit this book?
Yeah, I think I James Baldwin has a great quote that's like the book is never done. I'm paraphrasing. The book is never done. It's just the train has left the station.
Right.
um,
Yeah.
the goal is to write a sentence as clean as a bone. I think that yes is the very short answer. But I also think that as a writer, there's always revision. I really enjoy revision in the writing process. That's one of my favorite parts. For some folks and writers I've worked with, and students I've had in writing, they love getting it down. They love getting that first draft down. For me, that first draft is always just a little bit more difficult than revise. I just would rather have something, to work with. And of course, the only way you have something is if you get something down. So you sort of think you have to get. That's just the way you have to do it. So yeah, I think that there are things I would change, but I also think, in some ways, that it's a little bit of a time capsule. It becomes a little bit of a time capsule over time,
Right.
right? And in ways too, the books that I looked at, this travel guide that I held up earlier, that's a time capsule, right?
Right.
So yeah, I think there are things I would shift and change. I will tell you one funny story, which was that right before publication we were going over the very final edits, the very, very final where they send like a PDF and everything is placed on a page. And I talked to my editor and I was like, we should just cut chapter 6. I don't like it. I don't know what it's doing there. Let's just cut the entire. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the book is quite, it's a thin volume, right?
Hmm.
It's not a huge book. So cutting a whole chapter, in the 11th hour, not only would not make the most coherent narrative sense, but also would be a chunk of the book. But I think that was just nerves. My editor walked me back from that ledge. So I think there's a little bit of that too as a writer. You get up right up to the finish line, and it's like, oh wait. So yeah.
You mentioned your interest in doing research that goes into your writing. What's your writing process like? For example, do you like to write in the morning, in the evening? I know you're a young mother. Um, that
Yeah.
that's probably introduced a challenge in getting writing done. Do you have a preferred writing space or a writing time or a favorite process or pen? Do you write on a laptop or a PC, or do you write with a pen? What's your
Yeah.
mode?
Well, I think I'm sharpest in the morning. I prefer the morning. I do love this question because it's fun to get into, writerly habits. I always, I think there's like a great graphic from Brain Pickings on all these different writers, Maria Popova's website on all these different writers and what their daily habits were. And I think it was like Kurt Vonnegut used to like get up and write and then go swim and then come back and write and then,
Hmm.
time with his family. And I just always, what a life, that seems like, although it's still hard, it's still hard to write. There's kind of no way around that one. So I prefer the mornings. I think I'm the sharpest in the mornings. And I would say generally, I love the program Scrivener. I don't know if are you familiar with it. I also know a number of other writers who use that for kind of keeping. It's a program that also allows you to keep a lot of documents within one sort of program. Anyway, I use that a lot, especially when it's a research heavy project. And then, No, I don't have any. I mean, we always have sort of weird pen preferences, but I think part of this question too, because I've always I've asked it as well of other writers. It's this desire. I was like, is there a secret we can unlock to make this, to make this go better? And I think it's just so individual. It's tough because you just have to kind of figure it out.
You mentioned Kurt Vonnegut. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with his wife's book, Jill Kremnitz, who wrote it. I'll have to send it to you. She's a photographer. She was a photographer, and she took pictures of writers in their writing spaces.
That
So
would be great. That would be
I have to
great.
get your address. I'm going to send you a copy of it. So
Oh, that would be wonderful. Oh
he's one of
yeah.
my favorite. He's one of my favorite writers. But
Oh, that's
so,
great.
so I'm really interested in the environment of the writer and as a place for them to gather their thoughts. Just a couple more questions. One, I guess, is um, what kinds of travel writing did you try to avoid?
Mm,
What type of memoir travel writing did you try to avoid when you wrote your book?
that's a
What did
great
you not want it to be? Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I really wanted this to not be a book about, and I make a bit of a comment about this in the text. I wanted this to not be a book about essentially the savior narrative I really wanted it to not be white girl goes to Haiti, gets on a bus. There's like this American Life episode that sort of, this is what it's at, goes to Haiti. Oh my gosh, wow, get on a bus. The bus breaks down. Look, people helped us. And then we got off the bus and it turns out everyone is so nice. Like that really wasn't, that there's, I think, an oversimplification there, more than one. Um, there is a savior narrative. There is um, a sense of, um, I think a lot of the issue I have with stories like that is that they don't challenge the core issue of separation, right? When you start that story, there's a here and there's a there. And when you end that story, there's a here and there's a there. And there isn't a lot of challenge around how or why that boundary got there to begin with. And that was really important to me in this book, and especially because this was a book about Haiti, where the US, as I've mentioned early in this call, has had significant foreign engagement for 150 plus years, 150-ish years. I didn't want this to feel like a story where some of that larger context wasn't considered. And I didn't want this story to feel, I think, in the end, like a completely individual story. I wanted this to feel like a story that was part of a quilt, I think, rather than just one individual tale that is kind of a standalone for, I don't know, for something, right? For something bigger, like that all of it was like this. It's more like the opposite, right? That this is part of all of it, not that all of it is like this. So yeah, that was a really big concern and challenge in writing the book. And I found that one of the best ways that I ended up was facing that was just naming it and trying to say, here are the problems that I find with that. And maybe this book does some of that against even my own best intentions, but that was a huge goal.
Yeah, and this is my final question, but and I think that perhaps you've really addressed a lot of these issues. What advice would you give writers who want to tell stories about communities impacted by poverty without reducing them to their struggles?
I think, I have to say, I think a couple of things come to mind. The first one, and this is just a little bit of a pet peeve, but I'll put it out there as like a PSA because I see it a lot, and I work with writers. I've taught writing in the creative writing community, and I
Hmm.
see it a lot. And I think it's thought of from the best intention, but I think it could use a little bit of examining. This phrase of like, I see this on people's bios. I want to give voice to the voiceless, right?
Right.
Um, Dr. Sayantani Dasgupta teaches the class on um, disability illness narratives in the Columbia program for narrative medicine, and we discussed this idea a lot. And I've thought about it before as well, but no one's voiceless. I mean, unless they have a physical lack of voice, but then they often have another way to communicate. And in this way, when we say voice to voiceless, we really don't often mean physical, literal voice, right? We often mean power or story.
Or being unheard.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's an assumption there, right, that we walk in with if that's the framework. So I would just say to challenge that framework. I think that framework, I'm just problematizing that framework, but I think that framework assumes that the person walking in has all of the power and the person that they're speaking to has no power. And I think if we accept that as the framework from the beginning, we've kind of already lost. The person that you're speaking with has power and has their own life and their own story and their own, stuff going on, right? I think one thing that I think about when I work with writers or think about writing and telling stories of other people, it's partly as a writer, it's partly my responsibility to try to listen really well and figure out what those things are, what their landscape looks like from their perspective, knowing that you're probably never going to be fully in their perspective, in their shoes. There are going to be limits to what you can do or see or notice or report on. But I think we have to challenge that from the get-go. We have to challenge that framework of like, I'm doing you a favor.